housing type has really served the lives of so many individuals and families across the city. And today, it's actually built the fact that it's really difficult to build, especially because of the sort of high construction costs, land costs, and so many other challenges that exist. So from those conversations, from the ongoing community sort of conversations that we also held, we wanted to see what would it look like to actually build off what the work that we have done with folks last year, and to actually try to see how we could perhaps bring what we've been calling a future decker to life. So simply put, a future decker is a new rendition of the triple decker, and really centered around, what were some of the things that folks really liked about the three deckers, the decks, was the fact that you could listen to other individuals who lived in your building as well. Also the fact that it really allowed for generational wealth to be built over decades and now centuries, and trying to see what the challenges were so that we could perhaps modify those or course correct them for this future rendition. So needless to say, there are many ways that future decker look. So if you see behind me, these are the different sort of outcomes and ideas from many of the folks that are standing here in this room with us today, and then some of the folks who are also learning online, and just different perspectives and views for what can be possible to really improve the lives of residents in the city of Boston. And so, is this helpful? And this will be a little bit more helpful.
I just wanted to also say that I have my own sort of paranoias around COVID, and so this is a work in progress. This is the first time that I'm personally doing this today, so thank you for being here. So now that I've essentially run down through what the housing innovation competition has been, this is an approach that we tried before. So a few years ago, we had done another housing innovation competition where we looked at sites that we have within our inventory as the city of Boston. Also worked closely with the neighborhood organization to put out a request for proposals to see what versions of compact living or smaller living in the city could look like. And we thought that that was a really innovative approach for trying to see how folks can engage with one another. And so that is why we sort of leaned on this initiative to really think about what another housing innovation competition would be. And this time, we actually decided to break it up into two different phases. The first being the release of requests for ideas, which some of you responded to. So thank you again for doing so. And all of these ideas that you're also seeing here today will help to inform the second phase of the housing innovation competition, which we will work closely with folks and individuals to put together a request for proposals for a set of sites in the city on which folks can then develop as well. So I will essentially run down the different themes and outcomes of this first phase of the RFI. We received about 20 responses from different individuals and also groups. And what we did over the summer was to also take a look at the common themes that came out of those responses. So I will actually be walking down these panels so that you are able to really take in the information, and then afterwards feel free to sort of ask questions about this process, and then a few of us will go upstairs and hopefully continue this conversation as well. So, we also titled the competition Co-Creating Boston's Future Decker because as much as we really believe in the approach of design competitions, we also know that it is typically catered to a particular group of individuals. So design professionals, developers, folks that are already familiar with these, but we really wanted to see what the creation of different teams could look like. We know that oftentimes resident voices are not included in these processes, and really trying to think about how diverse teams can come together to achieve common goals as well. And so this is essentially a breakdown in this first panel. Just saying thank you again to everybody for participating. And we were really able to call out 5 different themes from this RFI. So definitely to those of you that submitted, please feel free to sort of then comment on, the different ideas that have come through, and also how you've responded to the RFI, because we'd love to hear a little bit more about your own experiences in submitting and being a part of this. But the first one here being adaptability and flexibility. So we know that this period of COVID is one where so many folks' relationships to their homes has really transformed and changed. And we heard that from the conversations that we had with individuals about their own lived experiences in 3-deckers. So folks saying that, maybe their decks aren't used the same way that they used to be. Maybe they were using their decks a little bit more and actually using them as office spaces, right? Or childcare spaces as well. And so we noticed that a lot of the responses actually really called out for the need to think about how spaces could transform over time, depending on how families grew over time, or just the different sort of uses that are related to a particular room. But then what we also called out in the RFI was something that we asked of all of the teams, which was to say, yes, we can have really great ideas, but what are the barriers that are actually standing in the way of bringing these to life? And so when we're talking about adaptability and flexibility, we also recognize that a lot of the responses actually called out for modular approaches, right? We know that there are numerous sort of barriers that exist when we're talking about the lack thereof, different infrastructural needs and regulations around how things can really move or transform over time. And so that is actually somewhat related to the next theme, which was living together. So from what we know about triple 3-deckers, we know that it is truly enriched by the opportunity to live close by other individuals and families as well. And so this was something that was really pulled out in the RFI, or called out in the RFI, not just necessarily because of the communities that you build within a particular building, but actually how that pours into the larger neighborhood as well, how many of these homes make up the neighborhood. And so in terms of the different barriers that were then laid out, we're really talking about, what currently stands in the way, and many folks called out zoning regulations. So thinking about, is there an opportunity to also have mixed use development? How can we think about incentivizing folks to have perhaps a commercial space on the first floor, and then also thinking of different ways of sort of living together in a particular building or neighborhood overall. Which then leads us to materials and construction. So we believe that this was a really sort of recurring theme in many of the responses as well, recognizing that we need to think creatively about how to save time, how to offer replicability, how to really ease for future adaptation as well, and then how to even help to build resilience to increase flooding. And really thinking about the different ideas that came through here as well, how a particular building is made up, how it comes together, the materiality of it all, but also how you put it together. And then just recognizing that oftentimes, again, we have limitations when it comes to the infrastructure that really allows for modular approaches or other innovative approaches to really take a hold. And then another theme that we know is truly in alignment with the city's goals around climate justice as well, is really centered around sustainability and building performance. So many of the responses really taking the time and consideration to think about how a building exists, not just in the present, but how it could also transform over time, and how it could be resilient over time as well. And then recognizing that, yes, we have all of the sort of goals laid out as a city, but how can we achieve those goals in a manner that can be really responsive to urgency behind the changes that are happening with our climate. And then lastly, which I believe is always the big elephant in the room when we're talking about housing development, is actually affordability. And so we recognize that this scale of housing is a typically challenging one to build, because we might not be able to build nearly as many units as well, meaning that there might not be different funding streams and funding sources that can really service this in order to make it and allow it to be affordable. One of the things that we learned from our research around triple deckers is that they actually ended up being relatively resilient because of the condoification of them as well. But if we're talking about thinking through homeownership opportunities, thinking through different ways to support renters in our city, how can we think innovatively around the financial models that currently exist, but also the financial strengths and funding services that are out there across the city, the state, and also federal funding sources that exist. And so these were some of the things that we believe were really key to helping us think through what the next phase of the housing innovation competition will be. We are really actively working with our internal development team to think through what the next immediate steps will also be, which will include truly robust community engagement plan, and also identifying the final sites that will be within our reach to really put out a request for proposals for. And some of this will take place for the next year as well. So I will pause here and invite questions from others. We do have another microphone here, but just wanting to say thank you again for being here, for participating in this initiative. We know that we can have all of these great ideas, and it is really assuring to know that you all are thinking actively about this as well, and how we can bring affordable housing opportunities to residents. But I think that it will take us all to really co-create Boston's future there. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, reflections on what you've seen here? I also recognize that I saw folks walk around earlier before. We were reading through some of these panels, but I'm curious to hear about your own experiences in submitting an idea of what we've just seen here today. Can I get the other microphone?
Hi everyone, my name is Ariane. I work with Caribbean Integration Community Development. I work with Canada. Really happy to be here. I wanted to ask specifically about the Living Together panel. I was talking to Jenny a little bit about it earlier. In terms of, in the eyes of a graduate student, I definitely can see that being an attractive living situation. A lot of times that is, what we end up doing anyway as students. But usually the goal is to, eventually move out of that, start a family, not have to worry about, who's doing the dishes and all that kind of stuff. So I was kind of wondering, one, if anyone kind of received any community input on that kind of idea and what that looks like, and two, how you would try to market that other than, simply affordability to, families, that kind of co-living space.
I appreciate that this was also a question directed to the other participants in this. So I'm super curious to hear from you all your thoughts on this as well.
So my name is Darwin Fortuna, Principal of Design Architects. We work with Fergus and Will our submission. We didn't necessarily get input from a particular community member, but the clients that we work with, for instance, we do so much in Dorchester, so much. So it was influenced by all of the different projects that we've done within the community. And I always bring in my grandma and my family into it. I'm like, how grandma lived with me for a long period of time and things like that, which are things that do happen a lot. We have another baby, what happens now, and all of that stuff, right? And then living through the different seasons of life, different periods of life. So that informed a lot of what we brought to the table when we were looking into this. And that's kind of why we actually submitted 2 designs. I don't know if you noticed it. We did 2 because it's very particular and a complex issue to resolve, right? And also like how to generate income on that process too, right? As you grow through the family and empty nesters and all that stuff. So that was kind of where we got all the way into it.
So there is a question from our virtual participants that what are the next steps in the process and how can interested parties get involved?
Okay, that is a great question. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we are working with our internal development team to really think through what the immediate next steps will be. For us, it will actually be taking a look at the different sites and selecting a number of them as well. So we had included 13 sites in our request for ideas, but naturally we cannot move forward with all of them. So really taking the input from the RFI responses to say, what is the most feasible site that we could really put out a request for proposals for, which would then lead to a successful outcome for this as well. So in addition to that ongoing sort of conversations and discussions, we're also going to be engaging with different community groups and continuing our engagement with different community groups to really see if these themes are in direct alignment with some of the things that they had mentioned to us prior to our release of the RFI, during our RFI sort of period, and now where things stand and if it's still in alignment, so that we can then think through what the next process for community engagement will also look like.
Okay. I also wanted to ask about the kind of RFP process. So is the RFP going to be released by you, or is that going to be released by like D&D, the city?
Okay, so luckily we are all one to some extent, right? So as I mentioned, my fellowship is still hosted by the DSA and also the Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab, which is embedded within the Department of Neighborhood Development. And so when we work towards an RFP, we're also looking at the sites that exist within D&D's inventory, sites that would be able to be up for disposition processes as well. And so we would be working closely with them, and that's the development team that I've been mentioning all evening. So, yeah.
So there is a possibility because D&D has all these properties that they would all end up in an RFP at some point, even if it's not through kind of this competition.
Yeah. So as much as we would be thrilled to put RFPs out immediately through this initiative for RFPs, we will be selecting one, but it definitely doesn't mean that the others won't be. So I think that because D&D typically goes through a public process as well, you need to know that there is really an incentive or sort of interest in a particular site or set of sites from different individuals. And so on that basis, the parcels can actually be put out for disposition processes as well.
I am Mark from Dallas Construction Corp. And the site's going to be made for more homeowners, developers. I mean, I know the city of Boston, over the course of time, would like to see homeownership come into place. And a lot of developers come in and try to build the properties and turn them over. In the past, the D&D has had developers come in and build them, and they have homeowners to take them from the developers and finance them, whichever way they do it. I'm just trying to figure out which, like a certain site's going to be designated for developers, or some going to be designated for homeowners. And if you are a contractor or developer and you want to help people get financing and help them get into the properties of ownership, how we would be able to do that and work with D&D.
So that is a really helpful question, right? I think that one of the things that is the key outcome for this as well is to really think about how to work collaboratively with other folks. So your development team could essentially be made up by folks that are really hoping to think through what different ownership opportunities could look like. So that could be other residents as well, but definitely developers, because in order to pursue an RFP, to be made up, you need to have an established development team as well. And so that is our key goal. But to answer your first question around, are we talking about sort of different homeownership opportunities? That is something that we're actually going to be actively having discussions about as well, how we should prioritize the ownership opportunities that are also in alignment, because we know that there's different funding streams that are specifically allocated for those processes as well. But we would just want to make sure that that is something that is in alignment with everybody's vision for what should happen on a particular site.
Hi, my name is Katie Faulkner, and I also participated in this with a fantastic team. I very much enjoyed it. And I'd like to comment because one of the things that I liked most about the process, but actually hope for in the next phase, is this demystification of actually how the process is done. The idea that all of these sites couldn't have been developed as of right, mean that they all have to go through a long zoning review process that adds time and therefore money to the process. And even someone like me, who's actually been in the business for a whole career, the learning curve is very, very steep. So the idea that one could, in their own neighborhood, identify a property, come together with a group, develop it towards homeownership, could be made easier, I think, if we developed a process through this that examined dumbing it down is not the right word, but making it more comprehensible. I think it's very complicated and time consuming and doesn't need to be, because some of these properties are relatively simple. So it was a wonderful process, and I hope that as we go forward to the next phase, we could do even a little more of that kind of education.
Thank you. I think that that's actually a really incredible point. One of the things that I didn't get to necessarily highlight was that just before we launched the request for ideas, so in January of this year, we had actually held a workshop that was titled Anti-Racist Design. And so instead of looking only at triple deckers in the city, we actually wanted to take a look at what the typical housing development process in the city looks like, and specifically through an anti-racist lens. And many of the sort of comments that came from folks were really centered around how do we demystify these processes, because you're right, they don't need to be nearly as complicated as they are, or we should just find ways to really, by providing technical assistance or other sort of services to really help guide folks through, because there are sites that are also not publicly owned, right? Small sites that can benefit from housing being built on them, but folks just don't have the tools to necessarily walk through that or the capacity or time to do so. So thank you for that comment. It's definitely something that we'll continue to pursue. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time as well. And I think I would like to, on behalf of our team here, say that we're really looking forward to you all engaging with one another and learning from one another as well. We've had time to really sit with these ideas and think through these different themes. I think that it is always truly beneficial to think about how you all might sort of interact with these ideas yourselves, and then also get to know one another. And so we will be going upstairs relatively soon for a few refreshments. To those of you who are online, please feel free to take a look at our story maps, where you can take a look at the different ideas as well. And just wanted to say thank you. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah.